Socrates said the only true wisdom is knowing when you know nothing. But that's not actually easy for humans to do because our brains want us to think that we are awesome. In 1995, MacArthur Wheeler walked into a bank in Pittsburgh ready to rob it. He didn't wear a mask, he didn't have like a fake mustache, he was just there robbing a bank in full view of everyone. He even smiled at the security cameras before leaving and going to a second bank to rob that one too. Later that night, the security footage allowed the police to pick him up and take him off to jail, which shocked him. He was shook. "I wore the juice," he famously exclaimed. Wheeler believed that rubbing lemon juice on his skin would render him invisible to videotape cameras. This is a cognitive bias at work, and it inspired two psychologists to create some experiments to understand it better. Cognitive biases are everywhere. Have you ever met someone who has one, like perhaps during a group project at school or during an argument with a stubborn uncle or when you had to toil alongside that coworker? You know the one I'm talking about. Somebody who believed they knew things but really they didn't. Believing you know something you don't is called the Dunning Kruger Effect. It's named for the two psychologists who, upon hearing about Wheeler's bank robberies, formulated a set of experiments to determine if Wheeler's juice beliefs were due to some kind of cognitive bias. Cognitive biases allow us to convince ourselves that something is true, even if the reality is different. Cognitive biases protect us from reality. They let us process information more quickly and they help us make decisions more quickly, but that doesn't mean that they are good. Cognitive biases are essentially a subjective social reality. The Dunning-Kruger effect is, in a nutshell, a way for everyone to feel good and above average internally, because most of us are actually completely average. Dunning-Kruger can help explain why people feel that they're experts even though they know very little about something, a problem sometimes described by this graph. The vertical axis is confidence, and the horizontal is experience. Imagine someone spent an hour reading the Wikipedia page about global warming, then took to Twitter to try and school some climate scientists who have literally spent their lives studying it. You don't have to imagine this, because you know it. It happens all the time. This cognitive bias is extremely common. For example, a 1992 survey of the engineers at one company found that 42% of them, 42%, believed they were in the top 5% of all the engineers at the company. But that's not actually possible. 42 cannot be 5. Another example is driving. One study found most people believe that they are above average at driving. But most people cannot be above the average. Another survey of people aged 77 years and older jived with that as well, most assuming they were average or above average. But again, that's not actually possible. Most people have to be average because that's how statistics work. The psychologists who first realized this bias was part of the human fabric did so in 4 studies: humor, logic and reasoning, and English grammar. We'll just take one. In the humor study, the psychologists asked 2 groups to rank jokes on a scale of 1 to 11, 1 being not at all funny and 11 being very funny. Group A was a set of average Cornell undergraduates, and Group B was a small set of professional comedians. The idea was to see if average people would believe that they were above average at picking out what was funny, or as good as professionals. After Group A had ranked the jokes, the researchers asked them to compare their ability to pick what was funny against the professional comedians, to rate themselves. And unsurprisingly, on average, everyone overrated their skills. Remember, 50 is average, and the whole group together said that they did 66, which I would rank as an 8 out of 11 on our joke scale. But this is where the surprise comes in. Those who did the worst placed themselves in the 58th percentile on average. They believed that they were better than 57 other people out of 100. Their real score? The 12th percentile. They were worse than 88 other people. These were the victims of this newly discovered cognitive bias, the idea that people with a little bit of knowledge or skill in an area believe that they are better than they are. Dunning and Kruger went on to show that this bias exists multiple times with different experiments, like when assessing effective leadership, raising children, constructing a solid logical argument, and so on. Generally, in each study, the participants in the bottom 25% of scores consistently ranked themselves in the 70th percentile. It is worth pointing out that self-confidence is extremely important. Self-esteem is valuable. We should all feel good about ourselves. That said, we should also have a good assessment of what we're good at and what we are not good at. For example, I'm pretty good at making science videos. I am not very good at kung fu, farming, or financial policy. It's easy to dismiss Dunning-Kruger as just overinflated ego, but that's not actually what's happening. Even ego can see its own limits, and there are some serious examples of people not even realizing their own failures thanks to this bias. These experiments work not just in humor, logical reasoning, and rules of grammar, but also have been replicated in math skills, wine tasting, chess, firearm safety among hunters, and medical knowledge among surgeons. And that's where things get really serious. A 74-year-old woman awoke from a simple spinal fusion surgery in terrible pain because her surgeon believed himself to be one of the best around. Instead, he's now in prison for life. He's accused of maiming multiple patients and causing 2 deaths. Meanwhile, he claimed, quote, everybody's doing it wrong, and that he was, quote, the best in the whole state. It's pretty amazing that it took us so long to give Dunning-Kruger a name because it is everywhere. The more we look for it, the more we see it. That said, Dunning-Kruger doesn't apply to everything, namely in areas where it's easy to compare. Baking, for example. If you assume you're an amazing baker, then you bake a cake and it's inedible, it's pretty hard to deny that you're a terrible baker. One paper I read said that most people who play golf don't believe that they are as good as Tiger Woods when surveyed, but I would guess if we asked, they would still rate themselves above average. Because an online survey of over 1,700 average adults in Great Britain found that 1 in 8 men believed that they could score a point against Serena Williams, the woman ranked #1 in tennis for more than 6 years. That said, it's very important to point out the Dunning-Kruger effect is gender neutral. It applies to us all. Interestingly though, Dunning-Kruger found the people at the top don't overestimate themselves. In fact, quite the opposite. Dunning-Kruger found the best around tend to rank themselves below their actual performance. Yeah, DK has 2 parts. People in the bottom 25% rank themselves at near the top, and people in the top 25 tend to rank themselves a bit lower than their actual score. This can help us understand why it is hard to counter Dunning-Kruger. In order to know you don't know anything, you gotta have to know something. An example, if your cognitive bias has you assume that you're amazing at driving, but you only drive in, say, rural areas of the desert Southwest, how would you ever find out that you're bad at it? You would need to drive around others or take classes to learn good driving habits or ride with someone who is objectively considered a good driver to see what you're doing wrong and then get that critique and recognize it and then learn. You think many of those people who believe they're good drivers are going to do those things? Yeah, I didn't think so either. In a bit of follow-up research, Dunning has found people who are low performers in reality are not good at accepting criticism and often don't show interest in self-improvement. He told Forbes, quote, research subjects were willing to criticize their own previous poor skills once they were trained up and could see the difference between their previous poor performance and their new and improved performance. But to get them to train up on their own was very unlikely. If we never change the knowledge that we assume we have, then we can just keep on going thinking we're amazing. Who doesn't want to do that? Even if we're not. Yay, cognitive biases. In the end, Dunning-Kruger is a cognitive bias that can affect anyone and everyone. If you're actually above average at any task, you might be undervaluing yourself. And if you're average or below average at some other tasks, you're probably assuming you're pretty good. In the age of the internet, everyone can be a quote-unquote expert. We all have access to infinite information. Our minds are drawn to learn a little bit about a lot of things. And that little bit of information is enough to make us weak-minded humans feel confident about what we know, even when we know nothing. And add to that the global platforms of social media, and then everyone can feel like an expert, and most won't accept any critique. Let's face it, I have probably been one of those people, and maybe you have too. It's crucial in today's overstimulated world to be able to differentiate a real expert from an overconfident novice. And that goes for understanding your value as well. The key is know your talent, understand your pitfalls, take criticism, and keep on learning. Way back in 1871, long before we knew what Dunning-Kruger was, Charles Darwin wrote, "Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge." And it turns out he was right. I wonder if Darwin would have rated himself as being above average on that one. Thanks so much for watching After School. It was awesome to get to work with Mark on this. I hope y'all liked it. If you want to watch more science videos, check out my channel, Una Dose of Trace. I make a new video every week that scratches that curiosity itch that we all have. Here's a recent one on the golden ratio and how it's not quite the mystical, magical thing that was promised.